The table looked the way it always did when my mother tried too hard. She'd pulled out the good placemats, the cream linen ones she kept folded in the cedar chest and only brought out for Christmas, and the one time a local news crew came to interview my father about the flood damage on Birchwood Road. There were two kinds of pie on the counter. She'd made a centerpiece out of sunflowers even though it was the middle of February, and sunflowers in February in Ohio mean someone drove 40 minutes to a Whole Foods and didn't tell anyone. My husband Greg stood at the kitchen island slicing bread. He'd offered to help the moment we walked in, the way he always did, because standing still in a room full of people made him quietly miserable, and having a task gave him somewhere to put his hands. Greg worked for the federal government. Specifically, he worked in a division that I had learned, over 6 years of marriage, not to ask too many questions about. I knew the building he went to. I knew the parking garage. I knew he came home tired in a particular way that wasn't physical, more like something had been pressing on the back of his eyes all day. He called it administrative work at family dinners, and my mother had stopped following up on that about 3 years ago. My older brother Ryan was supposed to arrive at noon. He arrived at 12:47, and when he walked through the door, he was wearing his uniform. He hadn't told anyone he was going to do that. My mother made a sound I can only describe as involuntary. My father stood up from his chair. My father, who has 2 bad knees and doesn't stand up quickly for anything, and crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled Ryan into a hug that lasted long enough that I had to look away. Ryan had been in the army for 11 years. He'd done 2 tours. He'd come back from the second one quieter than he left, which everyone noticed and nobody said out loud. He had a shelf of books in his apartment that he hadn't had before. He ran 6 miles every morning at 5 a.m. He was the person my parents called first when anything went wrong, the person my aunts asked about at Thanksgiving, the person whose name came up at church even though Ryan hadn't been to church since he was 19. He was the hero of our family. That was just the word for it, the one everyone used without deciding to. I was proud of him. I want to be clear about that. I was proud of him in a way that felt like it lived in my chest, something with weight and heat to it. I'd been proud of him since we were kids, and he was the one who knew what to do when things got hard, and I was the one who stood nearby, hoping he'd tell me. Greg looked up from the bread when Ryan walked in. He looked at him for a moment, not long, maybe 3 seconds, in the way Greg sometimes looked at things when he was thinking more than he was saying. Then he went back to the bread. He smiled when Ryan came over to shake his hand. He said it was good to see him. He meant it. Greg liked Ryan. They'd always gotten along. But something in those 3 seconds stayed with me. We sat down to eat around one. My mother had made a roast, and the potatoes she does where she presses rosemary into the tops before she puts them in the oven. My father, said Grace, the short version he does when he's hungry. Ryan sat across from me. His jacket hung over the back of his chair now, and he was laughing at something my father had said. And he looked, I don't know, he looked like himself, completely, entirely himself. So I don't know why I kept glancing at Greg. Greg was eating. Greg was nodding along to the conversation. Greg asked Ryan a question about the drive down from Columbus, whether the I-71 construction had cleared up yet. Normal questions, dinner questions. But his eyes weren't doing what the rest of his face was doing. I'd been married to Greg for 6 years. I knew the difference. I told myself I was imagining it. I reached for the salt. I asked my mother about the sunflowers and she lit up, explaining where she'd found them. And I listened. And I kept telling myself that whatever I thought I'd seen was nothing, that I was the kind of person who sometimes invented things to worry about, that Greg was just tired. We were clearing the plates when Greg touched my elbow. It was the lightest possible touch. If anyone else was watching, they would have thought he was just reaching past me, but his fingers pressed once, deliberately, and when I turned to look at him, he tipped his head very slightly toward the hallway. I followed him around the corner, past the bathroom, into the narrow stretch of wall, beside the coat closet where my mother keeps a small framed photo of me and Ryan at Ryan's high school graduation. Greg looked at me and said, quietly, "Does Ryan still have his DD-2114? I stared at him. A DD-2114 is a discharge document. I knew that much. I knew it because Greg had explained it to me once when we were watching a documentary. The way he sometimes explains things when he's watching something and his brain won't let the details sit unchallenged. What? I said. His discharge paperwork, Greg said. Has he ever shown it to you? Has he ever mentioned his discharge status to your parents? He was honorably discharged, I said. He told us he asking me this. Greg was quiet for a second. Not an uncomfortable quiet. A careful one. Something about his unit designation doesn't line up, he said. The one on his jacket. What do you mean it doesn't line up? I mean, I've seen that particular patch configuration before, and the timeline he's described, the deployment years, the base rotations, doesn't match what I know about that unit's history. He paused. It might be nothing. He might have transferred units partway through and just never mentioned it. That happens. But, I said. But I'd feel better if I could verify, he said. I'm not saying anything is wrong. He stopped. You know how I am. I did know how he was. That was the problem. Greg did not raise flags about things that weren't worth raising flags about. That was also just the word for it. I went back to the kitchen and helped my mother with the pie. Ryan was talking to my father about a fishing trip they'd been loosely planning since September. My father was nodding along with the specific enthusiasm of a man who knows the trip will probably never happen, but enjoys the planning of it. Ryan was laughing. He had the same laugh he'd had since he was 12. I put a slice of apple pie on a plate and handed it to my father, and I did not look at my husband. That night, Greg and I drove home mostly in silence. Not a bad silence. The particular silence of two people who have something to say and are waiting for the right moment, which is a silence I'd learned to recognize. We were almost home when I said, "Tell me exactly what you saw." Greg kept his eyes on the road. "The patch on his left shoulder," he said. The unit he said he was deployed with in 2018. That unit was stateside in 2018. A significant portion of them were at Fort Campbell for a training cycle. A small detachment went overseas, but the dates don't match what Ryan has described at various family dinners over the years. How do you know where that unit was in 2018? He glanced at me. Right, I said. We pulled into the driveway. He turned the engine off and we sat there for a minute. He might have been in a different unit by then, Greg said again. Transfers happen, reassignments happen. There's a completely reasonable explanation. But you want to verify. I always want to verify. I looked at the garage door. My neighbor's Christmas lights were still up. She always left them until March, which Greg found inexplicable and I found endearing. The street was quiet. Don't do anything yet, I said. Let me talk to him first. Greg said okay. I knew he meant it. I spent 4 days not calling Ryan. I thought about it constantly. I'd be in the middle of a meeting at work, staring at a spreadsheet, and the word discharge would surface in my head like something floating up from cold water. I'd be making coffee in the morning and I'd think about the way Ryan had walked through our parents' front door in that uniform, the way my father had stood up so fast. Ryan had built his whole life on that service. Or I thought he had. He talked about it the way people talk about the thing that made them. He'd done community work with veterans organizations for years. He mentored younger guys who were transitioning out. He had a certificate on his wall from the VR, and my mother had photographed it and sent the photo to about 15 relatives. If Greg was right, if there was something wrong with the timeline, with the discharge status, then none of those years of family dinners and proud toasts and framed certificates made sense. And if Greg was wrong, then I was about to call my brother and imply that I thought he was lying. I called him on a Thursday evening. He answered on the second ring. He was in a good mood. He'd just gotten back from a run. I could hear him breathing through the phone, that particular post-run breath. And the sound of it made me feel terrible because it was so normal and I was calling to do something that wasn't. We talked for a few minutes about nothing. How my parents were. Whether he'd found a good mechanic for his truck. The fishing trip, which he still seemed genuinely optimistic about. Then I said, "Can I ask you something about your discharge?" The line went quiet, not a normal quiet. The kind of quiet that has a shape to it. "What do you mean?" he said. I mean your DD 214, your discharge status. Ryan, Greg noticed something about your unit patch at dinner, and I've been trying not to think about it. And I can't stop thinking about it. And I can't stop thinking about it. Another silence. It's an honest question, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. You can tell me I'm wrong. I want you to tell me I'm wrong. Ryan didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't say anything for long enough that I had to check the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then he said very quietly, "Can we do this in person?" We met at a diner off Route 40 the following Saturday. It was the kind of place that had been there since the 1970s and seemed to run on institutional memory. The same booths, the same laminated menus, probably the same coffee. Ryan was already there when I arrived. He was sitting with both hands wrapped around a mug, not drinking, just holding it. He looked up when I sat down. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He didn't make me start. I was discharged in 2016, he said. Not 2019. And it wasn't honorable. I heard myself exhale. It was OTH, he said. Other than honorable. It's not the worst possible discharge, but it's not what I told you. It's not what I told Mom and Dad. A woman refilled the coffee at the table behind us. The diner was half full. Someone had a baby in a carrier, and the baby was asleep and peaceful and completely uninterested in anything I was experiencing. What happened? I said. He turned the mug in his hands. He was looking at the table. When I was 24, he said, I made some choices that I'm not going to try to excuse. I was running with guys who were pushing boundaries they had no business pushing. I knew it was wrong. I knew it when I was doing it. I was 24 and I thought, I don't know what I thought. That it wouldn't catch up with me. That I could manage it. He paused. It caught up with me. Ryan, I'm not going to tell you it was someone else's fault, he said. It wasn't. I made the choices. They caught me. The discharge was appropriate given what I'd done. He finally looked up. I've been living with that for almost a decade. I thought about all the things I knew about my brother and tried to fit them around this new shape. The VA certificate, the mentoring, the 6 a.m. runs, the fishing trip that would probably never happen. Why did you keep wearing the uniform? I said. It came out harsher than I meant it to. He nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for that one. Because I couldn't figure out how to stop, he said. Every time Mom looked at me like you know how she looks at me, I couldn't find the sentence that ended that look. I kept telling myself I'd tell you when the time was right, and the time was never right, and then years went by. Do you understand what that cost us? I said. Not just you, all of us. Dad stood up to hug you. Dad's knees, he doesn't do that for anything. My voice broke a little. I hadn't expected it to. Ryan looked at the table. I know, he said. You let us be proud of something that wasn't real. You can still be proud of me, he said. It wasn't defensive, it was almost a question. I didn't answer right away. We sat there for a while with the coffee going cold between us. Outside the window, cars were moving on Route 40, and the world was doing what it always did, completely indifferent to the two of us in a booth, rearranging everything we thought we knew. What happens now? I said. Ryan straightened a little. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. I looked at it. It was a printed registration confirmation. A veteran support program, not a ceremonial one, not a mentoring role where he could still wear the identity like a coat. It was a ground-level volunteer program, administrative work, coffee and chairs, and whatever needed doing. I called them 3 days ago, he said. After you called me. I've been thinking about this for years, but I needed someone to. He stopped. I needed you to ask. You also need to tell Mom and Dad. I know. Soon, Ryan, not when the time is right. There's never a right time for this one. He nodded. I refolded the paper and pushed it back across the table to him. I picked up my coffee. It was lukewarm and not very good, the way diner coffee always is. The way I somehow always forget until I'm already drinking it. I'm still angry, I said. I know, I need some time. Okay, But I looked out the window. I'm glad you're going to do this, the volunteer thing. I think that's right. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, and the nod had something exhausted and relieved in it at the same time. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes before I went inside. Greg was in the kitchen making dinner. He heard me come in and called something from the stove about whether I wanted garlic bread. Regular husband words. I walked into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at him. He confirmed it, I said. Greg set down the spoon. He turned around. Oath discharge. 2016, not 2019. He's been carrying it the whole time. I leaned against the doorframe. You were right. Greg was quiet for a moment. He wasn't saying I told you so. He was never that person. He was just holding the information carefully, the way he always did, the way I sometimes envied and sometimes found exhausting. How is he? He said. Ashamed, I said. Really ashamed. But I think he's going to do the thing now. The right thing. Greg crossed the kitchen and put his arms around me. I let him. I put my face into his shoulder and just stayed there for a minute. He's still your brother, he said quietly. I know. And he came to you when it mattered. After a decade, I said. After a decade, he agreed. But he came. I thought about my father standing up from his chair, the speed of it, the mees, the hug that lasted too long. I thought about my mother's sunflowers in February. Ryan called my parents on a Sunday. He drove out there. He didn't do it over the phone. He sat at the same table we'd all sat at for the roast and the rosemary potatoes and the good linen placemats, and he told them the truth. My mother called me that evening. She cried for a while, which I let her do without trying to fix it. My father didn't call me. My father processed things in a particular slow, private way that looked from the outside like calm and from the inside, I imagined, like anything but. He sent me a text that night that said, I think we're going to be okay. 6 words, from a man who didn't text. That was 3 months ago. Ryan volunteers every other Saturday now. He doesn't talk about it much, which I think is the point. It was never supposed to be the kind of thing you talked about at dinner. The VS certificate came off his wall. He told me he didn't throw it away. Just put it somewhere he didn't have to look at it every day. Greg never said another word about it. Not a single one. That was, I realized, one of the things I loved most about him. He raised the flag when something needed raising, and then he stepped back and let the people involved figure out the rest. My parents still talk about Ryan the way they always have. Differently now. The pride has a different quality to it, more complicated, with more knowledge in it. But it's still there. It didn't go away. I think about honesty sometimes in the way I didn't used to, about how a lie can seem like kindness at the beginning and become something heavier the longer you carry it. About how the people who love you are usually more capable of handling the truth than you decided they are. About how 10 years of protecting someone from something is also 10 years of not trusting them with it. Ryan called me last week. He was in a good mood again. He'd signed up for another month of volunteering, and apparently there was another volunteer he'd befriended, a man in his 70s who'd served in Vietnam and had, Ryan said, the driest sense of humor I've ever encountered. He sounded like himself. Not the version of himself I thought I knew 6 months ago. The real one. The one that took longer to find but was actually there. I told him about the fishing trip. I said we should plan a real date for it, not just an eventually. He said, yeah. He thought that was a good idea. I think it is too. I've thought a lot about the version of my brother I believed in for almost a decade. Not because that version was entirely false. Ryan is still the person who shows up, who runs 6 miles in the dark, who calls when something is wrong. Those things were always real. But I built a picture of him using pieces he handed me deliberately, arranged the way he wanted, and I never thought to look at what was missing from the frame. That's on both of us. That's how it works when someone you love decides to protect you from something by keeping it from you. You become a participant in the story without ever agreeing to it. What I keep coming back to is cause and effect. Not in a dramatic way, not like the universe was punishing Ryan for lying. More like choices have mass. You make one, and it doesn't stay still, it moves forward with you. Ryan made a choice at 24 that he didn't know how to undo, so instead of undoing it, he just kept moving forward with it. And every year that passed made the weight heavier and the telling harder. 10 years in, the lie wasn't even something he was actively maintaining, it had just become the shape of who he was to us. That's what years do to something unaddressed. They calcify it. Greg saw something in 3 seconds that the rest of us missed in 11 years. And I think about that too. Not because Greg is smarter. He isn't, not in any general sense, but because he wasn't inside the picture. He didn't have a decade of pride and memory and love softening his focus. He looked at Ryan the way a stranger might, just for a moment, and that was enough. There's something uncomfortable in that. The people closest to us are sometimes the least equipped to see us clearly, not from lack of intelligence, but from too much attachment. I don't think the answer is to love people less. I think the answer is to occasionally allow yourself to look at the people you love the way someone else might. And Ryan. What I want to say about Ryan is that his honesty, when it finally came, was the most complete thing I had ever seen him do. He didn't explain it away. He didn't ask for anything. He sat in that diner booth with cold coffee and said, "This is what happened. This is what I did. The discharge was appropriate." There is a particular kind of strength in that sentence. The discharge was appropriate. That I don't think I could have managed if the positions were reversed. Most people, when finally caught in something they've carried for years, will find a way to shift the weight slightly. Ryan didn't. He picked it up fully for the first time in front of me and held it without flinching. That's the thing about honesty. It's not comfortable. It doesn't feel like relief right away. It feels like exposure, like standing in a cold room without a coat. But it is the only thing that actually moves. Everything else, every careful silence, every half-truth, every year of letting people believe something easier, just keeps you standing still while time walks on without you. I'm not the same sister I was 6 months ago. I'm a little more willing to ask the hard question. A little less willing to take the comfortable version of something when something else feels off. Greg taught me that without meaning to, just by being the kind of person who notices. Ryan taught me the rest.